It's wonderful to know that your friends are always looking out for your best interests. You know, you get that abiding sense of confidence and trust. It just warms your heart and fills you with inspiration to go forward, doesn't it? Good morning. Aloha. It is wonderful to be together, isn't it? Oh, my goodness. It fills your heart with joy, really. You look out over the friends, and all of our cares and our worries are suspended. We're together, we're loving, our hearts are connected, and that's what's important about life. We have that abiding sense of trust and confidence and strength and power that we can't get under any other circumstances because we believe in Baha'u'llah. We recognize the Lord of the age, and we're together in that. We're unified in that. And any obstacle that is put in front of us, we can overcome because of the fact and the strength and the power of that belief. So, Ya Baha'u'llah, it is wonderful to be together. The sun's not shining now, but it is shining in our hearts. And we are together in that love and together in the warmth of that shining. There are so many things that I want to share with you. I promised some questions and answers because I know you have a lot of questions and answers, but I'd like to start out with a couple of observations about to follow up on some of the themes that we pursued yesterday. First of all, I want to briefly mention some of what I consider to be the significance of our movement into the fourth epoch. The fourth epoch of the administrative development of the cause signalizes a drastic shift in the rate of our progress and in the level of responsibility that we assume as individuals and institutions. And really, friends, we have seen this shift over time. I mentioned yesterday that at the 1983 International Convention, it was evident that the reality of the community had changed. We looked around at the National Spiritual Assemblies, and first, more than ever before, they were physically present. Second, they had come, many under great hardship. You know, everybody doesn't have an American Express card that they can use to get a Pan Am ticket to go to Harvard. Some had to walk. Some had to take bush buses. Some had to come by very circuitous routes because you can't go from one country to another where diplomatic relations are broken down. So you have to go from this one to this one to this one to that one to that one to Haifa. And it was very, very difficult. I myself was detained upon entry into Ben Gurion Airport. I still don't realize why that was, but it's terrifying, and I advise you not to be detained when you go into Ben Gurion. You know, I was with Farouz Kazim today. This is a story that briefly bears mentioning. I was with Farouz. We had come through Paris and into Tel Aviv. Now, Farouz was born and raised in Russia. He's Iranian, and now he lives in the United States. He's got a name like Kazim today. You figure he's going to have a little difficulty getting into Haifa, Israel. He gives his immigration papers. They wave him by. I'm an American. I was born here. My tax dollars support that country. I walked up, I gave my passport and my immigration papers. The lady didn't even look at them. She just pointed that gun at me and she said, "You come with me." I was, "What?" You come with me? See, I've seen this kind of thing on television, but I have never experienced it myself. And I said, "Look, you know, I don't take bullets well." There are limits to my ability to deal with stress. But she just kind of grunted and went, I'm not all stupid, I went with it. We went into a little room that said police headquarters. I knew I was in trouble. They sat me on a little chair. And 5 policemen, all in khakis and all with these guns, got over me like flower petals. They completely dominated. Just, who was I? Where was I going? Da, da, da. I said, "Surely you must have noticed. 1,200 Baha'is from all over the world have been coming through here for the last several days. I'm one of the last to arrive. You could not have missed it." You know, big buildings on the side of Mount Carmel. That's us. They finally let me in. But you know, the development of the faith institutionally into the fourth epoch has significant implications. Now, we know from the writings that part of that development is spiritually connected with the physical rise of the properties of the buildings in Haifa. The building of the seat of the Universal House of Justice has spiritual implications, even as it has physical and administrative implications. And even members of the House of Justice have said that they feel differently about their role and their vision and their responsibilities as they sit in the seat of the Universal House of Justice and survey the needs of the world and of the Baha'i community. And their vision seems to have expanded by the addition of some spiritual element, which is in some way associated with the rise of that physical structure. And we also know that the national spiritual assemblies around the world have greatly developed in their capacity to manage the affairs of their communities. These were the national spiritual assemblies that were represented in 1983. They were represented by the indigenous residents of those countries. These were the same national spiritual assemblies who went to 168 heads of state and presented, bold as you please, in the broad light of day, the peace statement of the Universal House of Justice, proclaiming the message of Baha'u'llah, finishing the task which Baha'u'llah started some 119 years ago. This is a dramatic development in the rise of our capacity as Baha'is to advance the progress of the cause. These are the same national spiritual assemblies that are sponsoring the development of universities, of medical clinics, of health centers, of literacy centers, of all kinds of social and economic development projects that go hand in hand with the rise of the spiritual characteristics of the faith, the spiritual objectives we have for our development. Now this all symbolizes the development of new culture, of Baha'i culture, and none of us knows what that is. We know that Baha'u'llah promised us that he would give rise to a new race of human beings. And we know that Baha'u'llah promised us that that new race of human beings would have spiritual qualities that would be very difficult for us to recognize. So apart from us would they be. But we have no idea what that implies for the rise of new culture. Let's talk about culture for a second. Because one of the implications of our movement into the fourth epoch is the birth of a new degree of Baha'i culture. What is culture? Culture is three things. One, it is habit, habitual patterns of behavior, how we act. Are we loving? Are we friendly? Are we outgoing? Are we accommodating? Are we consultative? Are we beauty-seeking? Are we minds rich in gems of inestimable value? The first measure of culture is just to look around you and to look at the patterns of habitual behavior. Look at your feast. Look at your firesides. Look at the patterns of interaction in your communities. The second measure of culture is habitual patterns of thought. What do we think about? What do we value? Do we pray every day? Do we get up in the morning and beseech our Lord for the blessings he has intended for us for that day? Do we pursue the beauty way? So the second measure of culture is habitual patterns of thought. Look at what you think about. Think about it. Reflect on it. Reflect on the patterns of consultation in your community as one of the evidences of the patterns of thought and the patterns of values. And the third measure of culture are the spiritual characteristics of your community. How does it feel here? Is it warm? Is it loving? Is it supportive? Is it welcoming? Is it friendly? Is it the kind of environment that breaks down barriers? Is it the kind of environment that makes everyone feel welcome? Is it a home for everyone? How does it feel here? The third measure of culture is the spiritual characteristics of the community. How does it feel? So, the three evidences of culture are the habitual patterns of behavior, habitual patterns of thought, and the spiritual characteristics of the environment. And this is a test that all of you can do. You can look at the culture of your life, and you can ask yourself, how do I behave? Just no value assigned. How do I behave? How do I think? How do I feel? How does that apply to my community, to the national Baha'i community? That is a very, or to the place that I work, that is a very reliable set of measures about your culture. And once you go through that exercise and simply list the characteristics, the patterns of behavior, the patterns of thought, the patterns of feeling, you can begin to identify the distance between where you are and where you want to be. And you can begin to say, if it's too contentious around here, if we're conflicting a little bit too much, then what I want to do is find harmony. What can I do to change that? Now, at the level of the National Spiritual Assembly, we have to look at this in terms of the culture of the American Baha'i community and look at the characteristics we have and the characteristics we want. And one of our challenges in the fourth epoch is to find ways to make major progress in the advance of our culture toward a new reality, one that is, to a greater degree, in compliance with the spirit and the principles of our faith. And so we did some things which have produced some great results. One was the Campaign of Unified Action, which said, take risk, be confident, release individual initiative. Let us not be so tied to our limited understanding of administrative principles. Let me see the hands of all of you out there who understand Baha'i administration. Let me see the hands of all of you out there who understand the application of the principles of Baha'u'llah to any situation. Or the real power of prayer. Or why consultation is the central principle of Baha'i community. The central principle, the foundation principle of Baha'i community. Let me see all those hands. We have one. Tony, I'd like to get some notes. It is comforting to know that we're not completely bereft of God. You see, the point is that we're all moving towards something we don't understand. None of us knows what is going to be in the future. None of us knows what is really risk and what is simply an audacious step in the right direction. Let me give you an example. The Universal House of Justice sent the National Spiritual Assembly a letter. It said, have a peace conference. That's all they said. It said, have a peace conference, make it somewhere around October of '86. We said, check. We had no idea what we were going to do. So we got to fiddling around and we said, well, now what are we going to do? Scratch, scratch, scratch. We said, one of the things that we need to do is we need to celebrate the achievability of peace. Because everybody out there thinks that we're going to get nuked to the Stone Age. It's true. Everybody thinks that we're going to be annihilated. Nobody really thinks that we're going to make it through this. Nobody understands that Baha'u'llah didn't spend all this time getting us ready just to blow us away. He spent this time getting us ready so that we could build a new spiritual and social and political and economic reality called the Kingdom of God's Heaven on Earth, or the world order of Baha'u'llah. That was the point. All of this grooming, all of these successive stages of development, social development, political development, scientific development, all this development was leading toward an end. And the end was the world order of Baha'u'llah. The end was not the annihilation of humanity. And we know that the leadership of that process is not the rulers, but the people, the meek. Because with the rejection of the proclamation of Baha'u'llah to the rulers, the meek did inherit the earth. That prophecy was fulfilled. And who are the meek? The meek are you and me. We have inherited that responsibility. And with that responsibility, we have gotten certain powers and certain kinds of assistance. And when we look at the effect of the peace statement on Baha'is and non-Baha'is, when we listen to what some of the best thinkers in our country have had to say about who the Baha'is are, and this tremendous statement with this vision that is more comprehensive than any they have seen to date on the subject of peace, going way beyond nuclear freeze, going beyond the retirement of chemical warfare, going to the real issues that are the roots of human strife and suffering. When we look at those things, we begin to see that we are about something much more essential, something that comes down to the kernel of our soul, something that gets right back to why God created us in the first place. I knew my love for thee, hence I created thee. Wherefore dost thou love me, that I may name thy name? That's who we are. I created thee rich, he says. Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee. Mighty, powerful. That's who we are. So when we say that we're the meek, and that we have this tremendous responsibility to advance the world order of Baha'u'llah, the kingdom of heaven on earth, let us not think of ourselves in terms of our day-to-day reality, because we'll be confused. When we think of ourselves, we think of our incapacities, not our capacities. We think of how bright we're not. We think of how balanced we are not. We think of how loving we are not, how stable we are not. You know, we don't think in terms of, gee, I'm great, I'm smart, I'm stable, I've got all this power and this assistance from Baha'i. We tend to think in terms of our incapacities, not in terms of our capacities. That's why we have to turn our eyes upward. We have to turn our hearts toward Baha'u'llah. Because it's in that relationship, it's in that partnership that we gain strength and power. Now let's talk about that. Let's talk about the application of those principles to a real situation. The Universal House of Justice writes us a letter and says, have a peace conference. And we don't know what a peace conference is because we've never done one before. We certainly haven't done one on this level. And so we decided that we would, in the spirit of the Campaign of Unified Action, we would try something that was strategically very risky. We wouldn't plan it ourselves. Now, we had planned to spend more money on this conference than we had ever spent on any conference, and we achieved that. We did very well. And we decided that we would have a celebration of peace, and that we wanted everybody involved. And that somehow it wasn't good enough to simply invite Southeast Asians, or to invite Hispanic Baha'is, or to invite Native Americans, or to invite... We had to go get them. We had to bring them to the conference. Because we wanted to create a new spiritual reality. And we decided that it wasn't good enough for the people at the National Center to plan the peace conference. That somehow the people in the Bay Area, somehow the people in California, had to have a real responsibility for the planning and the implementation of that conference. Now that was a lot of risk, because we've never done a peace conference before, and I know they have never done a peace conference before. And somehow the spiritual rightness of that decision was in releasing responsibility. So we went to California and we met with the spiritual assemblies from San Jose and San Francisco, and we said, you know, we got this letter from the Universal House of Justice, and the House said, have a peace conference. And we're not exactly sure what that means, but we're going to have a peace conference. And we'd like you to help us. As a matter of fact, we'd like you to assume a major amount of responsibility for the planning and implementation of that conference. And we made that beginning. We formed a pact. And they were shocked. You mean you're going to have a national conference in California, and you want us to be a part of the planning and implementation of that conference? And we said it wouldn't be complete if you didn't have a leadership role. This conference is in your town. It's got to be your conference. And so we began to release responsibility. And that is one of the first lessons of the fourth epoch. One of the characteristics of the fourth epoch has to be that we have to change our culture. First definition of culture, habitual patterns of behavior. We have to change our culture by releasing responsibility. Let me see again all the hands of those who know what the strategy for building the world order of Baha'u'llah is. You see, that's one of the reasons why we have to release responsibility. Because we will never understand the value and the wisdom and the essential nature of the contribution our Hmong and Cambodian brothers and sisters have to make to us. Our Native American brothers and sisters, our Hispanic brothers and sisters, our white brothers and sisters, all of them have to make to us unless we release responsibility. And we allow them freely and in their way to make their contribution to the development of this new thing called Baha'i culture, this thing we know nothing about, this thing that will give rise to this new race of human beings that Baha'u'llah has told us so much about. So the first step we took was to decentralize, to release responsibility. And we asked the spiritual assemblies of San Francisco and San Jose to begin to do some planning with us. And pretty soon we had 18 task forces, most California-based, on everything from entertainment to the children's program, to the blood drive, to service projects. All the events that made up the conference were planned and implemented by task forces of Baha'is. Now, how many of those Baha'is do you think had conference planning experience on that level? Maybe one, maybe two. We had 300 volunteers. How many of those Baha'is do you think had ever put together a conference for 10,000 people from all over the world? 32 nations were represented. And yet, this conference was the most magnificent achievement of its kind in the history of the American Baha'i community. It was a triumph in every way.
Was any of this a result of some sort of reaction to a tendency for over-administration within the Baha'i community, or was that at all in thinking when you decided to?
Well, I think that's a subtle observation. Anytime you are young, and our administrative organization is very young, you have a tendency to covet responsibility. You have a tendency to hold it closely because you're insecure about it. And the institutions are just as young and as inexperienced as all the Baha'is. We haven't built a world over Baha'u'llah before, and we don't know a lot about that. So as we have experience and as we mature, we begin to learn a little bit about how to let go of responsibility and about the importance of that. In human resource network theory, there's a very simple principle, and the principle is that the network has to be made up of givers and takers, and that there has to be a common goal, but a wide variety of ways to get there. Well, we kind of learned that lesson, and part of what that said to us was we had to find ways to bring in the contribution of other peoples and other institutions and other communities, and that would be righter than simply planning from a central spot. We could not plan, in our judgment, the conference we had to have, the conference that would really celebrate the capacity of human beings to establish peace based on the oneness, the spiritual oneness and unity of humankind from all men. That had to be the product of a variety of contributions. So we set about to devise a conference planning strategy that would assure us that we got the widest variety of contributions to the planning process, and that we put our confidence in our assumption that if we were successful in gathering those contributions, that what would result would truly be a flower garden, a spiritual flower garden, that would sing the highest praise to the Baha'i concept of peace. So that was the first strategy. The second thing was this. We hoped that in this exercise of releasing this tremendous responsibility, now remember that about $500,000 is riding on this. And this is the first time that we go out to humankind and say, we have something to say to humanity about its destiny and about the role of every individual human being in the shaping of that destiny. We hadn't said that before. We had not invited Baha'is and non-Baha'is to come together and consult on these most important topics. So in many ways, this was a very revolutionary step for us. And we decided that if we were going to step into the void of risk, that we would step completely, that we would not take half a step. And the result was magnificent. The result was magnificent. The relationship between the National Spiritual Assembly and those 7 or 8 spiritual assemblies that were directly involved in the planning and implementation of the peace conference has fundamentally changed. Those communities are not the same. They see themselves differently. Their spiritual reality has changed. Their concept of their own capacity has changed. The fortunes of the faith in their communities has radically changed. And the possibilities for the next step in our development have changed It was a truly significant development in that way. Now this says something to us about what our future must be, that we must find ways to address our need to expand the boundaries of our vision about what Baha'i community and what Baha'i culture is, so that we don't lock ourselves up inside of the notion that we have created. I'll tell you a story that was very meaningful to me and may have some value to you as well. You know, we all think of Baha'u'llah in very personal terms. I don't know about you, but I do. I think of him as my Baha'u'llah. And somehow, there's a selfish part of me that doesn't share him with you. There's a selfish part of me that's very hard for me to understand how you relate to your Lord in the same way that I relate to mine. In Haifa at the 1983 International Convention, we got up at 4:30 every morning and we went down to the Shrine of the Bab to say dawn prayers. It's easy to get up at 4:30 in Haifa because the sun comes up at 4. By 4:30 it's broad daylight. It's a good time to be working on the kibbutz. We went down to the Shrine of the Bab and we said prayers every morning. Well, by the last day of the International Convention, the Shrine of the Bab was flooded with people at 6 a.m. And we couldn't go directly into the shrine. So we went to the little hill in the back of the shrine and waited for the number of people in the shrine to reduce so that we could go in and pray. And there was a young Ghanaian man, about 23 years old, whom I had met earlier, who was preparing to go into the shrine. Now he was just getting ready to go in and pray, to get to the serious work. And in his prayer, in his preparation, he was completely outstretched, almost on his toes, with his arms lifting into the heavens, as if any moment he would soar off the ground and into the heavens, chanting the tablet of Alma. And I saw in a glimpse that the Lord he was praying to was my Lord, that he knew the same Baha'u'llah I knew. And there was such a sense of, here is a man I never met, I don't know him, I don't know his reality, I don't know where he comes from, I don't know what his life is, but we are bonded together in a way that that bond can never be dissolved, because we know Baha'u'llah, we share that. Somehow, we have to build our communities in ways that will allow us, free us, to establish that bond with all people. And that's where we have to go. That's where we have to go. That's who we have to be. Now I can see by the time that I have used much more time than I had thought I would. Let me make just a couple of other points about the fourth epoch and some of the evidences of our progress in that stage of our development. And then I'll answer a couple of questions and then turn it over to Bob Harris, who I think follows. The next evidence of our incredible administrative development is the differences of the plans of the communities coming back from the 6-year plan for Victory outline. In the past, when the National Spiritual Assembly has sent out requests for community plans, we have gotten back a very familiar set of plans. In fact, it almost represented the Baha'i credo. We're going to adopt an extension goal. We're going to raise the number of the people in our community from 9 to 15. We're going to have children's classes. We're going to have deepenings and so on. However, with the 6-year plan, there were dramatic differences in the patterns of objectives among communities. Dramatic differences. Communities came back and to a much greater level than ever before said, we want to pursue the teaching of the faith among minority populations in our community, either Southeast Asians or blacks or Hispanics or whomever, whatever minority population was represented in that community. Baha'i communities had identified the need to expand the diversity, the variety of Baha'is in their community, and identified that as an objective across a very large pattern. The other significant change was the frequency of the objective to reach out into the community. There were a large number of communities which said, we want to go out and perform social and economic development services to our community as an extension of our commitment to the service of humanity, and had specifically planned projects that they planned to pursue. There was a large number of communities which set as a goal the establishment of working relationships with other organizations in their community, organizations that shared similar interests. There was a large number of communities that said, we're prepared to supply materials and people for radio shows and television shows, and we've identified outlets that we want to pursue. In other words, one of the first measures of culture that we talked about at the top, habitual patterns of behavior, the behavior and the thinking of Baha'is has changed. And one of the evidences is the pattern of objectives that we have set for ourselves for the 6-year plan. Those patterns of objectives are much farther reaching. They are much less parochial. They are much less focused on the internal development of the Baha'i faith, and much more focused on reaching out in a much more comprehensive way to people in the greater community. Now, one of the other things that the Baha'is said was, we want some social life in our Baha'i community life. And there was a large number of objectives that talked about the need for parties, and dancing parties, and dinner parties, and good times. And that is a vital element of social development, of the distinctive characteristics of Baha'i community life. They want to have breakfasts, and they want to have dinner parties, and dancing parties, and all kinds of social activity to round out Baha'i life. So there's this marvelous balance beginning to become evident in the patterns of objectives set for the 6-year plan. On one hand, a much more audacious reaching out to the community at all levels and in much different ways. And on the other hand, a much more sensitive response to the need for a richer Baha'i community life. Now this is exactly where we need to go. And as we begin to explore this uncharted territory, we will invite people into the community, and we will have experiences that will only stretch us and help us grow, and help us gain a greater appreciation of the true value of the differences between us and what that helps us achieve. Now, these are just a few observations about the progress that we're making in the fourth epoch. I think to summarize it, and then we'll take a couple of questions. To summarize it, there has been a basic shift in the direction of the development of Baha'i culture. I personally believe that that shift, the impetus for that shift, was the sacrifices of the Iranian Baha'is. But the results have been extraordinary on many levels. We've seen the results in the international sphere, where the relationship of the Baha'i community as a whole to the governments and the leaders of the world has dramatically changed. Our profile is high, we are well recognized, we are increasingly well understood, our aims and objectives, our ability to get things done, and to move in some decisive and effective way to protect Baha'is being persecuted is much more well established. The visibility of the House of Justice itself, and particularly as a result of the release of the peace statement, has become very prominent, and it is recognized as a force. We have a presence on the world scene. We've seen a dramatic change in who we think we are. And all of a sudden, that image we had of ourselves as incapable, as unstable, as filled with deficiencies and flaws, is becoming less and less easy to justify. Because we see that even though we are the meek in every way, we get the power and the assistance from Baha'u'llah to do his work. And we have seen basic changes in the patterns of institutional decision-making, the process of objective development for the 6-year plan, the process of planning for the peace statement, the process of the campaign of unified action, releasing individual initiative, encouraging risk, expressing confidence in the judgment and the initiatives of Baha'is. And this is where we have to go. Because as we learned in the survey we conducted just a few minutes ago, this is not something we know a lot about, building the kingdom of heaven on earth. we have to do the best we can. And we have to trust that the mechanisms Baha'u'llah gave us of prayer, of consultation, of mutual assistance will be sufficient to get us out of any jam that our well-meaning initiative gets us into. Those are the good problems for us to have. Let me stop there and see if I can entertain a few questions. Yes, as a matter of fact, there was video documentation, audio documentation, and all of that will be edited and put together as quickly as it can possibly be done and distributed throughout the community.
And another question, there is a presentation by the, for the slide presentation of the Promise of World Peace.
Yes.
Is that going to be coming out on video?
That will be part of the video documentation. Yes, in the back. You see, this is the power of unified action. We did not know what we were doing. We trusted the process. We believed that we could gather information, that we could consult experts, that we could put a team together, several teams in fact, 18 teams, task forces, and that somehow we could put on a conference for about 10,000 people, Baha'is and their guests, and that it would work out. And what we got was more magnificent than anything we've ever done. And yet, in a real sense, it was done by less experienced people than we've ever used. The magic of the Peace Conference and its success was the unity of the undertaking. Let that be a lesson for us as we look at all the things we've never done before and try to figure out how it is we're going to do this well. Our first principle is unity. Our second principle is consultation. If we rely and put our confidence in those things, then we will find the way to tap the strength of Baha'u'llah and get that assistance and put something together that will be satisfactory, and in most cases much more than satisfactory.
Have the objectives of the fourth epoch been identified, the things that we need to accomplish before entering another?
You know, this is the process that the National Assemblies throughout the world are going through now in the development of the objectives for the 6-year plan. And the first step of that was to ask the communities in the United States community, and other communities have done the same thing, to begin to identify their objectives, their goals, and to consult with the agencies of the National Assembly and with the counselors and the auxiliary board members and others to get as good an understanding of their assessment of where we are and where we need to go as we could get. And then to glean from that a statement of vision represented by some goals and objectives which would allow us to chart a course through the next stage of our development. So that's the process that we're undergoing now. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to do it. I agree with everything up to the point. I guess one criticism I had was the children's class. I think there was a lot of chaos in the children's class with teachers wondering whether they're not showing up and parents leaving their kids and, and the kids being removed. I guess I'd like to recommend that the same kind of specialism that went into the adult session and the one day of the youth session really be devoted to the children. Because as we've all heard, they're the next generation.
Absolutely.
It's very important. Maybe even to the point of maybe setting up something like workshops where you have people that will say, okay, I'm going to do an hour and a half with the children. Instead of, I know it's hard for people to give up a whole conference to be a children's class.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the point you make is a very important point, and it was one that that was one of the areas of difficulty, because some of the folks that we had hoped would be there and assume some responsibility were not able to come. However, let me make an observation about generally. There are always two sides of an experience. And one of the characteristics of the Peace Conference was that we had some administrative glitches that we will draw circles around in our debriefing, which is going on now. What I'm pointing to, and what I think we need to point to, is that as we go through these unprecedented experiences, we chart this uncharted territory, we have to look at the spiritual and social significance of what was achieved. Now, the administrative problems and the organization of certain of the programs, like the children's program, are really the easier part of things to do. I mean, we can debrief on that, we can learn things from it, we can plan it better, and so on. What was the great achievement of that was the basic change in who we think we are and what our contribution to humanity is. I am beginning to run into Robert Harris's time. I would like to make one other point, and then let me give the microphone to Bob. I had a question submitted to me last night on South Carolina, and I cannot address the question, but I want to address a larger issue, and that is the development of South Carolina, the Native American Baha'i communities, and the development of the faith among Southeast Asians and Hispanics. We have started a process in South Carolina particularly, and perhaps South Carolina and the 65 spiritual assemblies on the Indian reservations symbolize this process to a greater degree than any other communities in our community, in our national community. We have started a process. We have made a beginning to raising new community among the South Carolinians, among the Native Americans. One of the objectives of the 6-year plan has to be the completion of that process, so that the South Carolina community, the Native American spiritual assemblies, the assemblies that we hope to raise among our Hispanic brothers and sisters, the assemblies that are beginning to form among our Southeast Asian brothers and sisters, become gems of social and spiritual development for all humanity to see. We cannot, as a community, progress unless we bring all of the family with us. We will not be complete so long as we are underrepresented by the different kinds of people that humanity consists of. We must have, and I cannot emphasize this strongly enough, we must have all of humanity as a part of our community. We must actively seek everyone in our community, high and low, rich and poor, black, white, yellow, and brown. If we are not represented in that way, then we are not complete. And the problems and the difficulties we have will be because of the absence of the contribution that certain of our family members have to make to our development. God has given the United States a very sweet blessing. He's gathered all the people in the world here in this country. Now we have to go and round up our family, because we cannot be at peace and one without all of the other members. It just is not the same. So as we look in our communities at what our objectives should be, let us look around and ask ourselves, what am I missing? Because there are no blacks in my community. What am I missing? Because the Southeast Asian residents of my community aren't represented in our Baha'i community. What am I missing? Because we don't have very many Hispanics in the American Baha'i community. What am I missing? Because we have not gotten to a level of spiritual peace where all of our brothers and sisters may be nourished, and we ourselves can find the nourishment that will satisfy the hunger of our souls. That is one of the objectives, if you will, of the fourth epoch. And I believe that we are stronger and more capable of pursuing that than we have ever been. We have learned a lot as a community. One of the big messages of the Peace Conference was that we have the message, and we have the spirit, and we have the love and the power. Now we simply have to recognize that, acknowledge it, and turn that